Chapter 26 The Horn of Alveric. Northward, to lonely lands through wearying years, Alveric wandered, where windy fragments of his grey, gaunt tent added a gloom to chill evenings. And the folk upon lonely farms, as they lit the lights in their houses, and the ricks began to darken against the pale green of the sky, would sometimes hear the rap of the mallets of Niv and Zind, coming clear through the hush from the land that no others trod. And their children, peering from casements to see if a star was come, would see perhaps the queer grey shape of that tent, flapping its tatters above the last of the hedgerows, where a moment before was only the grey of the gloaming. On the next morning, there would be guesses and wonderings, and the joy and fear of the children, and the tales that their elders told them, and the explorations by stealth to the edge of the fields of men, shy peerings through dim green gaps in the last of the hedgerows, though to look toward the east was forbidden, and rumors and expectations, and all these things were blended together by this wonder that came from the east, and so passed into legend, which lived for many a year beyond that morning, but Alveric and his tent would be gone. So day by day and season after season, that company wandered on, the lonely mateless man, the moonstruck lad, and the madman, and that old grey tent, with its long twisted pole, and all the stars became known to them, and all the four winds familiar, and rain and mist and hail. But the flow of yellow windows, all warm and welcome at night, they knew only to say farewell to. With the earliest light and the first chill of dawn, Alveric would awake from impatient dreams, and Niv would arise shouting, and away they would go upon their crazed crusade before any sign of awakening appeared on the quiet, dim gables. And every morning, Niv prophesied that they would surely find Elfland, and the days wore away, and the years. Thil had long left them. Thil, who prophesied victory to them in burning song, whose inspirations cheered Alveric on coldest nights, and led him through rockiest ways. Thil sang one evening suddenly songs of some young girl's hair. Thil, who should have led their wanderings. And then one day in the gloaming, a blackbird singing, the May in bloom for miles, he turned for the houses of men, and married the maiden, and was no more with any band of wanderers. The horses were dead. Niv and Zind carried all they had on the pole. Many years had gone. One autumn morning Alveric left the camp to go to the houses of men. Niv and Zind eyed each other. Why should Alveric seek to ask the way of others? For somehow or other their mad minds knew his purpose more swiftly than sane intuitions. Had he not Niv's prophecies to guide them, and the things that Zind had told on oath by the full moon? Alveric came to the houses of men, and of the folk he questioned, few would speak at all of things that lay to the east. And if he spoke of the lands through which he had wandered for years, they gave as little heed as if he were telling them that he had pitched his tent on the colored layers of air that glowed and drifted and darkened in the low sky over the sunset. And the few that answered him said one thing only, that only the wizards knew. When he had learned this, Alveric went back from the fields and hedgerows, and came again to his old grey tent in the lands of which none thought. And Niv and Zind sat there silent, eyeing him sideways, for they knew he mistrusted madness and things said by the moon. And next day, when they moved their camp in the chill of dawn, Niv led the way without shouting. They had gone for many more weeks upon their curious journey, when Alveric met one morning at the edge of the fields men tended, one filling his bucket at a well, whose thin, high, conical hat and mystical air proclaimed him surely a wizard. "Master," said Alveric, "of those arts men dread, I have a question that I would ask of the future." And the wizard turned from his bucket to look at Alveric with doubtful eyes, for the traveler's tattered figure seemed scarce to promise such fees as are given by those that justly question the future. And such as those fees are, the wizard named them, and Alveric's wallet held that which banished the doubts of the wizard, so that he pointed to where the tip of his tower peered over a cluster of myrtles, and prayed Alveric to come to his door when the evening star should appear, and in that propitious hour, he would make the future clear to him. And again Niv and Zind knew well that their leader followed after dreams and mysteries that came not from madness, nor from the moon. And he left them sitting still and saying nothing, but with minds full of fierce visions. Through pale air waiting for the evening star, Alveric walked over the fields men tended, and came to the dark oak door of the wizard's tower, which myrtles brushed against with every breeze. A young apprentice in wizardry opened the door, and by ancient wooden steps that the rats knew better than men, led Alveric to the wizard's upper room. The wizard had on a silken cloak of black, which he held to be due to the future. Without it, he would not question the years to be. And when the young apprentice had gone away, he moved to a volume he had on a high desk, and turned from the volume to Alveric, to ask what he sought of the future. And Alveric asked him how he should come to Elfland. Then the wizard opened the great book's darkened cover, and turned the pages therein. And for a long while all the pages he turned were blank. But further on in the book much writing appeared, although of no kind that Alveric had ever seen. And the wizard explained that such books as these told of all things, but that he, being only concerned with the years to be, had no need to read the past, and had therefore acquired a book that told of the future only, though he might have had more than this from the College of Wizardry, had he cared to study the follies already committed by man. Then he read for a while in his book, and Alveric heard the rats returning softly to the streets and houses that they had made in the stairs. And then the wizard found what he sought of the future, and told Alveric that it was written in his book, how he never should come to Elfland while he carried a magical sword. When Alveric heard this, he paid the wizard's fees, and went away doleful. For he knew the perils of Elfland, which no common saber, forged on the anvils of men, could ever avail to parry. He did not know that the magic that was in his sword left a flavor or taste on the air like that of lightning, which passed through the border of twilight and spread over Elfland. Nor knew that the Elf King learned of his presence thus, and drew his frontier away from him, so that Alveric should trouble his realm no more. But he believed what the wizard had read to him out of his book, and so went doleful away. And leaving the stairs of oak to time and the rats, he passed out of the grove of myrtles and over the fields of men, and came again to that melancholy spot, where his grey tent brooded mournfully in the wilderness, dull and silent, as Niv and Zind sitting beside it. And after that, they turned and wandered southwards, for all journeys now seemed equally hopeless to Alveric, who would not give up his sword to meet magical perils without magical aid. And Niv and Zind obeyed him silently, no longer guiding him with raving prophecies, or with things said by the moon, for they knew he had taken counsel with another. By weary ways, with lonely wanderings, they came far to the south, and never the border of Elfland appeared with its heavy layers of twilight. Yet Alveric would never give up his sword, for well he guessed that Elfland dreaded its magic, and had poor hope of recapturing Lyrizel with any blade that was dreadful only to men. And after a while Niv prophesied again, and Zind would come late on nights of the full moon to wake Alveric with his tales. And for all the mystery that was in Zind when he spoke, and for all the exultation of Niv when he prophesied, Alveric knew by now that the tales and the prophecies were empty and vain, and that neither of these would ever bring him to Elfland. With this mournful knowledge in a desolate land, he still struck camp at dawn, still marched, still sought for the frontier, and so the months went by. And one day where the edge of earth was a wild untended heath, running down to the rocky waste in which Alveric had camped, he saw, at evening, a woman, in the hat and cloak of a witch, sweeping the heath with a broom, and each stroke as she swept the heath was away from the fields we know, away to the rocky waste, eastwards towards Elfland. Big gusts of black dried earth and puffs of sand were blowing towards Alveric from every powerful stroke. He walked towards her from his sorry encampment, and stood near and watched her sweeping. And still she labored at her vigorous work, striding away behind dust from the fields we know, and sweeping as she strode. And after a while, she lifted her face as she swept, and looked at Alveric. And he saw that it was the witch Zerundarel. After all these years, he saw that witch again, and she saw beneath the flapping rags of his cloak that sword that she had made for him once on her hill. Its scabbard of leather could not hide from the witch that it was that very sword, for she knew the flavor of magic that rose from it faintly and floated wide through the evening. "Mother Witch," said Alveric, and she curtsied low to him, magical though she was, and aged by the passing of years that had been before Alveric's father. And though many an earl had forgotten their lord by now, yet she had not forgotten. He asked her what she was doing there, on the heath, with her broom in the evening. "Sweeping the world," she said. And Alveric wondered what rejected things she was sweeping away from the world, with grey dust mournfully turning over and over as it drifted across our fields, going slowly into the darkness that was gathering beyond our coasts. "Why are you sweeping the world, Mother Witch?" he said. "There's things in the world that ought not to be here," said she. He looked wistfully then at the rolling grey clouds from her broom that were drifting towards Elfland. "Mother Witch," he said, "can I go too? I have looked for 12 years for Elfland, and have not found a glimpse of the Elfin Mountains." And the old witch looked kindly at him, and then she glanced at his sword. "He's afraid of my magic," she said, and thought her mystery dawned in her eyes as she spoke. "Who?" said Alveric, and Zerundarel lowered her eyes. "The king," she said. And then she told him how that enchanted monarch would draw away from whatever had worsted him once, and with him draw all that he had, never supporting the presence of any magic that was the equal of his. And Alveric could not believe that such a king cared so much for the magic he had in his old black scabbard. "It is his way," she said, and then he would not believe that he had waved away Elfland. "He has the power," said she. And still Alveric would face this terrible king and all the powers he had, but wizard and witch had warned him that he could not go with his sword. And how go unarmed through the grisly wood against the palace of wonder? For to go there with any sword from the anvils of men was but to go unarmed. "Mother Witch," he cried, "may I come no more to Elfland?" And the longing and grief in his voice touched the witch's heart and moved it to magical pity. "You shall go," she said. He stood there half despair in the mournful evening, half dreams of Lyrazel, while the witch from under her cloak drew forth a small false weight, which once she had taken away from a seller of bread. "Draw this along the edge of your sword," she said, "all the way from hilt to point, and it will disenchant the blade, and the king will never know what sword is there." "Will it still fight for me?" said Alveric. "No," said the witch, "but once you are over the frontier, take this script, and wipe the blade with it on every spot that the false weight has touched." And she fumbled under her cloak again, and drew forth a poem on parchment. "It will enchant it again," she said, and Alveric took the weight and the written thing. "Let not the two touch," warned the witch, and Alveric set them apart. "Once over the frontier," she said, "and he may move Elfland where he will, but you and the sword will be within his borders." "Mother Witch," said Alveric, "will he be wroth with you if I do this?" "Wroth?" said Zerundarel. "Wroth? He will rage with a most exceeding fury beyond the power of tigers." "I would not bring that on you, Mother Witch," said Alveric. "Ha!" said Zerundarel. "What care I?" Night was advancing now, and the moor and the air growing black like the witch's cloak. She was laughing now, and merging into the darkness, and soon the night was all blackness and laughter, but he could see no witch. Then Alveric made his way back to his rocky camp, by the light of its lonely fire, and as soon as morning appeared on the desolation, and all the useless rocks began to glow, he took the false weight and softly rubbed it along both sides of his sword, until all its magical edge was disenchanted. And he did this in his tent, while his followers slept, for he would not let them know that he sought for help that came not from the ravings of Niv, nor from any sayings that Zind had had from the moon. Yet the troubled sleep of madness is not so deep that Niv did not watch him out of one wild sly eye when he heard the false weight softly rasping the sword. And when this was secretly done and secretly watched, Alveric called to his 2 men, and they came and folded up his tattered tent, and took the long pole and hung their sorry belongings upon it. And on went Alveric along the edge of the fields we know, impatient to come at last to the land that so long eluded him. And Niv and Zind came behind with the pole between them, with bundles swinging from it, and tatters flying. They moved inland a little towards the houses of men, to purchase the food they needed. And this they bought in the afternoon from a farmer who dwelt in a lonely house, so near to the very edge of the fields we know, that it must have been the last house in the visible world. And here they bought bread and oatmeal, and cheese and a cured ham, and other such things, and put them in sacks, and slung them over their pole. Then they left the farmer, and turned away from his fields and from all the fields of men. And as evening fell, they saw just over a hedge, lighting up the land, with a soft, strange glow that they knew to be not of this earth, that barrier of twilight that is the frontier of Elfland. "Lyrizel!" shouted Alveric, and drew his sword and strode into the twilight. And behind him went Niv and Zind, with all their suspicions flaming now into jealousy of inspirations or magic that were not theirs. Once he called Lyrizel, then, little trusting his voice in that wide, weird land, he lifted his hunter's horn, that hung by his side on a strap. He lifted it to his lips and sounded a call, weary with so much wandering. He was standing within the edge of the boundary. The horn shone in the light of Elfland. Then Niv and Zind dropped their pole in that unearthly twilight, where it lay like the wreckage of some uncharted sea, and suddenly seized their master. "A land of dreams," said Niv. "Have I not dreams enough?" "There is no moon there," cried Zind. Alveric struck Zind on the shoulder with his sword, but the sword was disenchanted and blunt, and only harmed him slightly. Then the 2 seized the sword and dragged Alveric back, and the strength of the madman was beyond what one could believe. They dragged him back again to the fields we know, where they too were strange and were jealous of other strangeness, and led him far from the sight of the pale blue mountains. He had not entered Elfland, but his horn had passed the boundary's edge and troubled the air of Elfland, uttering across its dreamy calm one long, sad, earthly note. It was the horn that Lyrizel heard as she spoke with her father.